Hi, I like Risk of Rain 2. I also like RWBY, so I'm going to make a video that nobody asked for and combine those two fandoms. A popular thing to do in Risk of Rain Modded is to add characters from outside fandom, and seeing how RWBY is a show with multiple fighting characters, I think it would fit right in. All the passives and abilities will be based off of the attacks in the show as well as who they are as a person. I've watched the show going on 8 times now, so I'm confident that I know what I'm talking about. There will be spoilers for RWBY in this video, so if you don't want that, leave the video on in the background. Oh, I need the ad revenue, that's a joke. And if you like what you see in this video, I would very much appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel. There are a lot of characters in RWBY, so we won't be doing all of them. The subject of today's video will be only the main 8 characters of the first 3 seasons, the people in Team RWBY and in Team Juniper. Starting off with our titular main character of Ruby Rose, it's said in quotes because she's not really, there are 2 options for her passive in my eyes. Passives in general were pretty easy to come up with since there was a thing called semblances in the show that were quite literally like passives for each character. However, RWBY has silver eyes, which is very important to the show and acts in a way as a second semblance. And since this is specific to her, I will be using this as her passive instead. Silver Eyes. Once per stage, unleash your Silver Eyes to encase all enemies within 50 meters in stone for 10 seconds after taking damage below 20% health. This would work like a Genesis loop, but instead of a huge charge-up explosion, it would be an instant blast. This might be stronger than other passives or too strong to fit into the game, but that's a working theme in these videos, okay? I don't really care. I just want fun over balance when it comes to these abilities, but, you know, I still think it'd be a cool idea. Crescent Rose is the name of RWBY's weapon, and like most weapons in the show, is both a melee and a ranged weapon. RWBY mostly uses Crescent Rose as a scythe rather than the sniper rifle, so I decided to make her primary a melee, which will be a theme for a lot of the characters since most of the fights are close range. Crescent Rose. Swing Crescent Rose in a 4-stage attack for 120%, 120%, 200%, and 3 times 220% damage. The first 2 swings will have a proc coefficient of 1, the second swing will have a proc coefficient of 1, and the third attack will have a proc coefficient of 0.4 per each swing. As stated, this is a 4-stage attack along the lines of Mercenary's primary, but it's just a little bit more complicated. The first 2 swings are just that, a 180-degree swing in front of you that deal 120% damage, same as Mercenary. The third swing is a higher damage attack that swings in a circle around you, a horizontal one. And that last stage, RWBY would spin vertically 3 times for slightly higher damage. All of these attacks would help you pause your vertical momentum as well because you need something to stop yourself if you're falling. RWBY's secondary is a ranged alternative to her primary, and is pretty complicated. It's good to learn this part now because it comes in later a lot in a lot of the other abilities. Crescent Rose, Sniper Rifle. Fire Crescent Rose in front of you for 350% damage. Holding R opens a dust menu, which allows you to change your rifle ammo between electricity, fire, gravity, and ice dust. Cooldown of 4 seconds, and the bullet has a proc coefficient of 1. Okay, dust, yeah, I know, it's confusing. I struggle with it constantly. So, dust is like a mineable element in the world of RWBY that does different things depending on what it is made of. There are more types than just these 4, but they are rarely mentioned or are really specific to the show, so I didn't want to overcomplicate the ability. Dust types would do this. Electricity would have a similar effect to the overloading aspect, where it would shock any affected enemies 1 second after the shot hit for 20% total damage. Fire dust would obviously burn enemies. Gravity would lift up the enemies 20 meters and keep them suspended for 5 seconds, and ice dust would slow large enemies and bosses and outright freeze light enemies. This dust variation idea will be part of some other characters, so really keep it in the back of your mind. RWBY's utility is where I finally bring in her semblance into the picture. For context, her semblance in the show is called Petal Burst, and is basically a burst of speed where she physically turns into a ball of rose petals and can move very quickly from one place to another. She also technically stops existing when she does it, like she changes her atoms to move. It's really complicated. I love it. The show is good. Please watch the show. Petal Burst. Burst into petals and gain free movement, invulnerability, and increased speed for 3 seconds. Cooldown of 6 seconds. If free movement isn't clear, think of how D.Va from Overwatch flies her mech in that game. It would be a constant forward acceleration, and moving your mouse would change the direction of where you flew. Finally, we are at RWBY's special ability, which was the hardest to come up with. I sort of put all of my creativity points for her into the other abilities, so this is where I ended up. Crimson Execution. Bleeding. Lunge forward 10 meters and latch onto an enemy. After attaching, fire crescent rows and tear through the target for 750% damage. Cooldown of 8 seconds, and the tear has a proc coefficient of 1. I like this, okay? I'm actually surprised with myself. It is fun, and it's inspired from a moment in Season 4 where RWBY uses the recoil from her sniper rifle to propel the scythe backwards and sever one of her adversary's limbs. It would be violent and visceral, just like her playstyle. Her fighting style, I suppose. Her playstyle in the game. Don't think about my words too hard, they mean nothing. Moving swiftly onward, we have our pretentious doofus Weiss, who was one of the most difficult characters to make abilities for since she is ridiculously complicated in her fighting style in the show. Weiss has a lot of different attacks in that show, so it was hard to choose which ones to sculpt into the fit of Risk of Rain. Weiss's semblance in the show is her glyphs, a hereditary semblance that allows her to summon these ornate circles that do various things based on her will, such as slowing time or something like that. These were the inspiration for her passive. Glyphs. Enemies leave ice glyphs on the ground below where they died. The glyphs slow enemies and increase your speed by 20%, when touching them. She uses her glyphs regularly in the show and practically relies on them for combat. I wanted to change her playstyle from her fighting style in the show because, to be honest, I don't love how she fights. Making her passive like this allows them to take more of a backseat role in her kit and give more attention to her other, more fun abilities. Weiss's weapon is named Myrtenaster, and is a rapier revolver combo that shoots dust cartridges. Remember the dust? It's just like that, but gunpowder. She fights a very balanced, ranged, and melee style, and has a heavy amount of precision before every strike. Her primary will be a melee as well, but will be a little bit more aggressive and precise than RWBY's was. Myrtenaster. Lunge forward with your rapier for 200% damage. Holding down the attack button allows you to target an enemy within 20 meters and lunge at them for 400% damage instead. Lunge has a proc coefficient of 1. This attack would allow you to change targets quickly and fluidly, which I think is important to Weiss's character and how she attacks in the show. Moving swiftly onto her secondary, we go to the revolver part of her weapon. Dust cartridge. Fire a homing projectile from your weapon that deals 300% damage. This projectile has different effects depending on your current equipped dust. Cooldown of 3 seconds, and the projectile has a proc coefficient of 1. Don't worry about the second part of this ability's description. I'll explain how dust works into her kit later. Weiss uses the most variety of dust into her attacks, so I made sure to incorporate as much as I could into this. The specific effects that would change depending on your dust would be the same as RWBY's different effects in order to have some shared aspects between all the characters. I want it to be intuitive if you're going between characters. Weiss has the ability to summon mockeries in the form of various enemies in the show. There was no way in hell I was not going to involve them in this video. Summoning. Summon a creature to assist you. This creature's form depends on your equipped dust. Cooldown of 20 seconds. So, that might seem simple, but let me expand it and hurt your brain just a little bit more. Specifically, your options would be Armageddon, a phantom humanoid knight with 150% health and 100% damage that is useful if you want a jack-of-all-trades character, similar to the Beetle Guard. A Queen Lancer, a wasp phantom that is slow with like 200% health and 400% damage. A Nevermore, a huge crow phantom that is fast but weak and is useful for dealing big damage on a single enemy with 100% health and 600% damage. And a Borbitusk, a boar phantom that barrels through large groups of enemies with 100% health and 400% damage. I didn't choose to think of the attack speeds of these summons, but for a good rule of thumb, think the stronger the attack, the slower the summon attacks. The summons would be chosen via your equipped dust. Armageddon to ice, Queen Lancer to gravity, Nevermore with fire, and Borbitusk with electricity. You would only be allowed to summon one at a time, and the cooldown would start once your existing summon dies. I know that was a lot, and I'm sorry. So let's move on to her special. Equip Dust. Reveal a dust menu that allows you to pick between electricity, fire, gravity, and ice dust, which changes the effects of your abilities. Finally, this ability wraps up her kit by giving her a more active way to change up your playstyle. It would have no cooldown, and I imagine the neat thing in the settings would be a way to change how you cycled, where instead of opening a dust menu, you could just press E once and it would cycle through them. Now we move on to Blake, who is my personal favorite of the main four. Blake has a very undefinable fighting style. In the show, she is explicitly unpredictable in her fighting and mixes ranged fighting with an aggressive close combat style. She is extraordinarily acrobatic, and that is exactly what I chose to highlight in her abilities. Blake's weapon is the most complicated until we get to Pyhhra. While she is my favorite character, her weapon isn't so great. Blake's weapon is named Gamble's Shroud and is a sword, a sheath, and a pistol. She uses the sheath and as a cleaver-like weapon, and often fights two-handed with both the sheath and the short sword within it. The pistol is connected to the base of the sword and acts as its hilt. See, I told you it was complicated. Blake's semblance allows her to create a fake copy of herself that takes the hit for her. I wanted this to be one of her abilities though, not her passive, because I wanted you to actively choose to do it instead of it being something in the background. So instead I came up with this. Confusion. All attacks have a 10% chance to apply a stack of Confuse. Confuse slows enemies' attack speed and makes them move erratically. Only one stack of Confuse can be applied on an enemy at a time. Each stack lasts 15 seconds. Blake's fighting style is all about misdirection, so I thought a debuff that made enemies worse at fighting, specifically slowing how fast they attack, would really fit her as how she affects the enemies she fights against in the show. Blake's primary will, as the previous trends might have alluded, be a melee attack, Gamble's Shroud. Slash in front of you for 120% damage. Your attack speed is increased up to 50% depending on how low your health is. Slash has a proc coefficient of 1. The increasing attack speed with decreasing health thing wasn't really inspired by anything, except for how Blake tends to have a very aggressive and fast fighting style, and has a few moments where she becomes very desperate in a fight. Blake's secondary is inspired by how she uses her ribbon bow from her hair as a sort of grappling hook in the show. Ribbon. Throw your ribbon 40 meters in front of you and attach to an environment. Press the primary fire button while attached to fire your pistol behind you up to 5 times and propel yourself forward, dealing 100% damage. Refiring this ability severs the connection. Cooldown of 5 seconds, and the bullet has a proc coefficient of 1. I imagine this would be more like a Spider-Man style swinging rather than the pull towards grapple that Loader has. It would be a little niche, but it would be fun and would allow you to move freely around the map as well as comboing into some of your other abilities. The bullet is only part of this for flavor, because it would be very difficult to kill anything with it. Her utility is what I chose to base off of her semblance. I wanted it to be an active and reactive thing, rather than a background out of your control type ability. Shadow. Leave a decoy of yourself and become invisible for 4 seconds. The decoy distracts enemies and applies Confuse to any enemy that attacks it. The decoy has a 15% chance to be enhanced with Dust. Cooldown of 8 seconds. Dust is being involved again, but this time it won't be an active thing like the last two were. In this ability, the decoy has a 15% chance to become enhanced with Electricity, Gravity, Fire, or Ice Dust, which all allow different effects to the enemies that attack it. Electricity would stun them, dealing a low amount of damage. Gravity would push them back with a non-damaging explosion, though it would hit them with fall damage. Fire would explode similar to the Will-o'-the-Wisp and burn enemies, and Ice would obviously freeze them. Lastly, we have Blake's special, which is where I will finally incorporate her pistol into her kit. Gamble's Shroud Barrage. Target an enemy within 40 meters and quickly fire your pistol for 12 times 60% damage. Cooldown of 10 seconds, and the bullets all have a proc coefficient of 0.3. I think the barrage would be slightly inaccurate depending on the range of the attack. This is actually inspired by a few scenes in the show where Blake becomes very desperate in a fight and just sort of blindly fires the gun at whatever she's fighting. While Blake's fighting style is graceful, it isn't exactly perfect, and she frequently succumbs to her emotions, so that was what inspired a lot of her abilities. And now to end off Team RWBY with our final character, Yang. Yang was a bit of a struggle when it came to making her abilities because in the show she doesn't really have a ton of variety in her attacks. Most of her fighting is intense hand-to-hand combat, and while that's great in the show and makes for really great scenes, it is not too easy to translate into Risk of Rain 2, since she's not exactly fighting humans. Yang's passive, however, was obvious. Her semblance in the show is the ability to, after taking damage, enter this rage-filled state where she hits harder and moves much faster. So, inspired by Void Fiend's corruption meter, we have Burn. Taking damage fills your burn meter. When full, all your attacks apply burning. All of your abilities become augmented, your damage is multiplied by 2, and your movement speed is increased by 20%. This passive sounds strong, I know, but I think the balance of having to fill it with taking damage would take a really long time. I imagine that it would last about 15 seconds and would have a visible change to her character model just as it does in the show, with her hair being on fire and her pupils turning red. We'll get into how each ability becomes augmented, but for a good rule of thumb, they'll be faster and slightly stronger attacks overall. Yang's weapon is super neat, but it suffers from a small inconsistency problem in the show. It takes the form of 2 bracelets that unfold into gauntlets. The ranged part is where the inconsistency comes in, and is unclear whether the gauntlets fire shotguns or if they shoot flares. As an avid viewer of the show though, I'm gonna have to go with their flares since, especially in the first 3 seasons, she uses them at range a lot more than she uses them at close range. Heavy spoilers as well, but at the end of season 3, Yang loses her arm and is eventually replaced by a robotic prosthetic. I think it would be cool if her in-game model had this prosthetic arm instead, because let's just be real, it looks cooler. Ember Celica. Punch in front of you for 150% damage. Every third punch fires a burning flare for 300% damage. When raging, all of your punches explode in a 5-meter radius for 200% damage instead. The punch has a proc coefficient of 1, the flare has a proc coefficient of 1, and the explosion from when you're raging has a proc coefficient of 0.6. I wanted Yang's overall fighting style to fit more of a reckless brawler type since that's how she is in the show. This primary ability accentuates that, and would be a very violent close-range option made to punish any enemy that gets close to you. In Season 7, basically the entire cast has their weapons upgraded by a scientist integral to the story. Yang's particular upgrade is to her gauntlets flares, where they can now be used as timed bombs. This was the inspiration for her secondary. Timed flares. Fire 4 flares from your gauntlets that stick to enemies and deal 10% total damage. Refiring the abilities detonates the flares, dealing 250% damage each in a 10-meter radius. When raging, fire 8 flares instead. Cooldown of 8 seconds. Flare has a proc coefficient of 0.4, and the explosion of the flares have a proc coefficient of 1. I added the total damage part of this ability because when she does use the timed explosion in the show, it's often a fight-ending ability. I don't want it to be too strong, but I think after making her abilities, it just seems like that's how it's going to be, and she's gonna be a stronger character overall. Arguably in the show though, she is the best fighter on the team anyways, so let's just call it lore balancing or something. Yang's usual choice of movement when it comes to fighting is to use the recoil from her gauntlets to send herself flying. Before I read this ability off, I'm gonna say that I really like it, okay? And I'm proud of myself. Launch. Fire your gauntlets behind you in a cone of fire and propel yourself forward 20 meters, dealing 300% damage. When raging, gain 2 extra charges and decrease the cooldown by 20%. Cooldown of 8 seconds, and the explosion has a proc coefficient of 1, and the explosion while you're raging has a proc coefficient of 0.5, because you'll have more of them. This ability would allow a nice target-to-target style of movement, and I think it would be really fun. If it feels a little bit bland, I think that's fine. I just think the bounciness would really add a lot to her character. Yang's special ability is also inspired by Void Fiend and works similar to his special ability. Gotcha. Upon activation, take 50% of your maximum health in damage and fill your burn meter by 50%. When raging, explode into a 30-meter radius for 800% damage. Cooldown of 16 seconds. The explosion is a proc coefficient of 1. This ability allows her passive to be more of an active ability, similar to how Blake's Semblance was roped into her kit. 50% of your health was intentionally that much because her rage state is really strong. I wanted this ability to be something you plan ahead for, so it's up to you if you are willing to make the health sacrifice for very strong ability augmentations, as well as the increased damage from her passive. And that's Team RWBY done. Let me know which of these characters would be your favorite to play in the comments. I need the retention. I think my favorite of the 4 is Yang, and I imagine I'd play her a ton considering I'm an ex-loader main. I'm in therapy for it. And now we are on to Team Juniper, and since they aren't as prevalent in the story as the main 4 characters were, their abilities were a bit tougher to make up. Nonetheless, here they are. Jaune is Juniper's leader, and he isn't exactly the best of fighters. In Season 1, we find out he lied about his fighting ability. Spoilers again, sorry, sue me, go watch the show. In reality, he is kind of garbage at everything though. So for this reason, I'm going to design all of his abilities around post-Season 5 him, since that's when he gains his semblance and is also drastically increased when it comes to his fighting styles. Jaune's semblance is a strange one to come up with. In the show, his semblance is the ability to amplify other people's auras, which is basically like the ability to heal yourself or a shield for yourself to block hits. It allows them to heal their wounds faster as well as hit harder. This was obviously a struggle to translate into the game since you play alone, but I believe I had the ability to find a decent alternative, since another fact about Jaune is that he has an abnormally large amount of aura himself that allows him to boost others. So here is what I made his passive. Aura Amp. When out of combat, gain 10% temporary barrier per second. The first hit you take after being out of combat has its damage reduced by 30%. I intended to design Jaune as a very tanky character, so this is the first step in doing that. This is one of the more balanced passives, I think, and overall I like it. If I were to change it at all though, I would add like a cap for that barrier, like a 50% max health or something, but I like where it stands right now, so that's where it is. Jaune's primary attack is inspired by both the modded character Paladin's primary, as well as the scene in Season 4 where he does almost as described, basically verbatim. His weapon's name is Crochet Moors, and is a combination sword and shield. His weapon is upgraded twice, once in Season 4 and once in Season 7, and now has 2 extra abilities that I will outline before I describe how they will fit into his kit. Firstly, the sheath for his sword is actually his shield, and when sheathed, he can fold the sides of the shield in to cover the sword and turn it into a heavier hitting weapon. The other upgrade is the ability to, when crouching down, extend the sides of the shield out using hard light dust. Don't worry, I'll explain it later, just to give him that little bit more protection. That's a lot of explaining, I know, but I understand that a lot of people watching this video have not seen the show, and I want to explain this as clearly as I can without talking about them for too long. It's a hard mix. Anyways, on to his primary. Crochet Moors. Wing your sword in front of you in a 3-stage attack for 150%, 300%, and 450% damage. The sword has a proc coefficient of 1. This is a simple attack, but I think it would be a fun heavy hitter for big groups of enemies. I think it's obvious, at least to me, that Jaune's secondary had to be a shield, since he does not have a ranged alternative. This was inspired by the modded character Enforcer, pretty obviously, but also includes the shield pulse he uses frequently in the show. Protective Stance. Enter a protective stance and hold your shield in front of you. While in this stance, all damage in front of you is blocked. Your speed is reduced by 30%, and you cannot jump. Pressing the primary fire button while in this stance releases a pulse that knocks back enemies 10 meters. Cooldown of 1 second, and the cooldown of the pulse is 3 seconds. I think the Shuriken item would be very useful for Jaune, since he has a low mobility melee character. This is a niche that isn't really in the game yet, so I had a lot of trouble making his abilities since there wasn't a lot to compare them to. This next ability is one of the only abilities that's not directly from the show, but is instead a new bit of tech that I am making up just for this video. Jaune isn't known for his high mobility in the show, and I had nothing really to go off utility-wise, so I tried to take one of the things he uses in the show and change it around a bit, or a lot really, to make this. Hard Light Slow Field. Throw a projectile that, after a 1-second charge time, creates a 30-meter diameter area that slows enemies by 75% and deals 100% damage per second. Cooldown of 12 seconds. Slow Field is a proc coefficient of 0.2 per second. To those of you asking, what the heck is Hard Light? I'm sorry, I wanted to avoid explaining Hard Light because it's kind of complicated. To summarize, remember dust? Yeah, this is artificial dust. While every other dust is natural and mined, the Hard Light is manufactured and is basically only ever used like a shield. Like I said before, the slow field is not a thing in the show, but Jaune does use something similar in Season 7. This projectile extends into a stationary shield and is also made of Hard Light. This is what inspired the slow field, since I think I want something more offensive, not just another shield. I had fun with Jaune's special ability. If you can't tell, I really like transformation and augmented abilities, so that's what we've got going on here. Extended Aura. Extend your aura and increase your armor by 100 for 15 seconds. When in this state, your primary attacks also fires a ranged sword slash that deals 200% damage and stuns smaller enemies. Cooldown of 10 seconds. The sword slash has a proc coefficient of 1. This is another ability that isn't exactly in the show, but is indirectly inspired by a specific moment. In Season 7, there is a scene where another character tries to teach Jaune how to extend his aura. In the show, extending your aura is to turn basically that aura shield into a physical object, such as a simple extension of your arm to hit things that are farther away from you than your arm can reach. This is where I ended up, though, and I think it's fine. Nora is my favorite character from Team Juniper for obvious reasons. She's the powerhouse of the team, and is exactly the fighter I'd want to see in Risk of Rain 2. Nora's semblance was tough to add into the game, since in the show it is the ability to absorb electricity and power up her next attacks. I will incorporate this into her kit, but for now, her passive is this: be strong and hit stuff. After killing an enemy in one hit, increase your speed by 10% for 5 seconds and increase the damage of your next attack by 50%. I wanted Nora's kit to be mostly just big hits all around. This passive is a good starting off point for that, and it will add some fluidity enemy to enemy to her playstyle. Nora's weapon is called Magenheil, I think. I don't know how to pronounce it. I don't know. It's not the hardest to pronounce though. Okay, we'll get to that. It's a combination hammer and grenade launcher. Her weapon is really neat, and this is where most of her abilities will revolve around, including her primary, Magenheil. I think that's how you pronounce it. I could not find a way to pronounce it. I tried searching it up and everything. There's nothing. Swing in front of you for 350% damage. When airborne, increase the damage to 500%. Hammer has a proc coefficient of 1. I want to encourage verticality with Nora, and this complements that nicely. In the show, she is often the one to deliver the final hit when it comes to fighting a big monster or something, so I don't have a lot to say about that though. So let's move on to her secondary, her grenade launcher. Magenheil grenade launcher. After a 1-second animation, hold your hammer into a grenade launcher. Pressing the primary attack button fires an impact grenade that deals 200% damage in a 5-meter radius. Cooldown of 1 second. Grenade has a proc coefficient of 1. This attack is more fun. Big explosions all around, and that's exactly what I wanted. This provides a more ranged alternative to her primary if you don't have the health or just don't want to stay close to a teleporter fight, or whatever. Nora's utility will be basically what her kit revolves around. It is her only movement ability and will be super useful to complement the increased damage while airborne part of her primary attack. Valkyrie Jump. Swing your hammer vertically and jump 30 meters into the air, dealing 400% damage. Cooldown of 8 seconds, and the hammer has a proc coefficient of 1. This is another simple one, but I want to point out how much it would add to her movement. In tandem with her passive and her primary attack, she could really dish out some damage. Think about Huntress's utility. It's very simple, but integral to her kit. And Nora's last ability is her special. High Voltage. Root yourself and call down a lightning strike on yourself, dealing 800% damage and stunning enemies in a 40-meter diameter explosion. Cooldown of 15 seconds. Explosion has a proc coefficient of 1. I find it strange how little I have to say about these abilities. It's like I don't feel the need to justify any of them because they're just so cool. I am right about this since, I guess, how many other videos of RWBY characters becoming RoR2 Survivors have you seen? After all, if there's a weirdo Justice League x RWBY crossover series, then this really isn't that crazy. Pyhhra, by far, was the most difficult character to come up with abilities for. This is because, and heavy spoilers, she may or may not make it past Season 3. With only like 5 fight scenes of hers to work off of, I hope I did well. If this part seems short, this is why. Pyhhra's semblance did not make this easier. It is polarity and is the ability to control poles, or I mean control magnets. She can pick up metal from afar, and often depends on it in a fight. However, how am I supposed to make this into ability? I'm not sure, so I bent the rules a little and poured a healthy dose of suspended belief into the kit. It won't be her passive though, which is this: the Invincible Girl. If there are more than 8 enemies within 20 meters of you, increase your attack speed by 25%. This passive is inspired by the fact that, regularly, she is able to hold her own against multiple opponents as well as enemies much stronger than herself. Honestly, they only killed her off in Season 3 because half of the plot later would have been solved if she was there because she's just built different, alright? Pyhhra's weapons are complicated both in their name and their design. And I'm sorry for pronouncing these. I tried searching up how to pronounce these and I could not find anything. Mio and Akuo, I think, are a javelin sword that turns into a rifle and a small arm shield. It allows for super intricate fighting, and I want to put that into the kit, so I will, but we'll get to it. Mio, trust your javelin in front of you. God, I spent like 8 hours writing this script straight because I physically cannot break, so just pretend that says thrust. Thrust your javelin in front of you for 100% damage. This ability can be comboed with a cool. Javelin has a proc coefficient of 1. I will explain the combo part soon, but first I'll explain the secondary so that we can get to that. Ah, cool. Move your shield in front of you and block a single attack. This attack can be comboed with Meal. Cooldown of 1 second. I have no clue if I'm pronouncing them correctly again, so sorry. I tried searching up pronunciations and couldn't find anything. The combos would be done similar to how they are in most fighting games, where you can alternate left and right click to combine the attacks for more creative ones. A left-right, right-left type thing would make a bigger attack, but since there are technically infinite possibilities here, I didn't bother making any, so you can. Go tell me about them in the comments. Please comment, please, please. Huh? This next ability is where her semblance finally comes in, and also where the suspension of disbelief shows up as well. Polarity. Tear a chunk of metal from the environment and hover it in the air. Refiring this ability throws a projectile, stunning enemies and dealing 400% damage. 20% chance for the metal to be a chunk of dust instead. Cooldown of 10 seconds, and the metal has a proc coefficient of 1. If you've ever played Control, and if you haven't, you can watch my playthrough, shameless plug, this would be the same as how Jessie in that game uses her telekinesis to pick up rocks, but it would only be metal. The randomized dust would be the same as Blake's utility ability as well, being a random effect on the projectile that has a little bit of flavor to the attack. Pyhhra's javelin can also be used at long ranges by using the recoil of the rifle. This is the inspiration for her final ability, her special. I'm sorry. After a 1-second animation, slow time and aim your javelin. Pressing the primary attack button throws the javelin for 500% damage, rooting the enemy. Cooldown of 8 seconds. The javelin has a proc coefficient of 1. The name is a quote that she says very often in the show. The ability, I think, would be lots of fun to do mid-air and, it would just feel super cool all around. A good ability overall for silencing that annoying stone golem for a bit as you deal with the smaller enemies. Finally, our last character in this video, Ren. Ren is a fun character, but I don't know if he's anyone's favorite. He is a very important character to the early story, but later on I feel like he falls off a bit in his self-centeredness. Regardless, here are his abilities. You don't need me to talk about the show, because by God, this would be an 8-hour long video if I complained about every character. Ren's semblance is tranquility, and he's the ability to mask another person or his own aura. This is useful for hiding themselves from the creatures of Grimm in the show, which they're just monsters, okay? I'm not explaining everything, go watch the show. Tranquility. At the start of the teleporter event, mask your aura and gain invisibility to all enemies at least 20 meters away. I didn't want this to be too strong, so that's what the at least 20 meters part is for. The enemies close to you will still attack you, but this might help you with those hectic fights, like a wisp from across the map won't be trying to shoot you. I couldn't decide how long I wanted the ability to last, so I didn't write any in. Ren's weapons are a nice breath of fresh air from the complicatedness of Pyhhra's. Stormflower are dual pistols with vertical knives sticking downwards from their barrels. He has a get-in, get-out, strike of opportunity style of fighting, who rarely loses his head in a fight. This might be surprising, but based on the fight scenes in the show, the ranged part of his weapons will be his primary attack. Stormflower. Rapidly fire your pistols for 30% damage. Bullets each have a proc coefficient of 0.3. This is our simplest ability in the video, but sometimes that's a good thing. Imagine this just as Commando's primary, but faster and slightly weaker. The way Ren uses the guns in the show makes them look more like a whittling down weapon rather than a killing item, which is how I wanted it in-game. In Season 7, Ren's weapons are upgraded by having the ability to fire the blades from the front of the guns to grapple onto enemies. This absolutely had to be a part of his kit, and this is how I chose to incorporate it. Chain grapple. Bleeding. Fire your knives and attach to an enemy, dealing 300% damage. Releasing the button pulls you to larger enemies and pulls smaller enemies to you. Cooldown of 5 seconds. Knives have a proc coefficient of 0.8 when they hit. This ability will blend nicely with the others by allowing good mobility. Unfortunately, I decided to make the decision to make it so that if you missed an enemy with this ability, it would not act as a grappling hook. If the knives didn't hit anything, they would just recoil back to you and reset the cooldown. Also, since he has 2 guns and they shoot 2 knives, if one hits an enemy and the other misses, that wouldn't be a part of that. If one hits, both of them hit. Important lore from Season 4, ours, Ren's father gives him his dagger. This dagger is the same as those on the end of his guns, but is just a simple knife. I felt I had to use this in his abilities, so here's where we are. For myself, bleeding. Dash forward 10 meters and slash in front of you with your dagger for 250% damage. Finishing blows decrease the cooldown by 1 second. Cooldown of 6 seconds. Dagger has a proc coefficient of 1. Am I making Mercenary again? No, but I won't lie in saying this wasn't inspired by his utility. This acts as a nice movement ability that also encourages you to use it offensively as well as just a movement ability. Also, yeah, I used a quote again for the name of the ability, but I like it and I also do not care. You'll have to watch the show to find out where it comes from. And our last ability in this entire video is Ren's special ability. Barrage of Slashes. Bleeding. Rapidly slash in front of you for 10 times 100% damage. Cooldown of 10 seconds, and each knife slash has a proc coefficient of 0.4. This ability would mix really well with his secondary, and I really like the idea of grappling to a boss and then just laying into him with the knives to shred him to bits. It sounds like fun overall. So that's it. We're done. Let me know in the comments which of these characters sounds like the most fun to play and which you'd like to see in the game. If you'd like me to do this again with some other characters from RWBY or from other outside franchises, I'd be happy to, though no promises for franchises I know nothing about. I had more fun than I thought with this, and I hope you enjoyed it as well. Thanks so much for watching this really specific video idea that I imagine nobody was asking for. If you enjoyed it, I would really appreciate it if you liked the video and subscribed to the channel, as it helps me out a lot. I put this reminder in all of my video essays, but if you have any gripes or disagree with any of the game balancing in this video, just be nice about it. Anyways, thanks so much for watching again, and bye-bye.